I think when you see like the small percentage of young kids who really do get fired up about climate action, sometimes they burn out because they expect things to change overnight. And so that's where I get a lot of joy from the intergenerational conversation, where sometimes you have older folks saying like, I love your energy. And also, this is a long haul. We're going to be working this the rest of our lives.
If you listen to this podcast, I'm going to assume you care about the environment. 3, 2, 1. If you listen to this podcast, I'm going to assume you care about the environment. And while there is much we can do today, tomorrow, and in the years to come to combat climate change, how do we impart our passion into the next generation without overburdening them, or worse, making them feel like there's no hope or it's a problem too big to solve? This is Plugging In. I'm Barry Wygel. Welcome to Plugging In, powering our way to a brighter and healthier New York. I'm your host, Barry Wygel. Each episode on this podcast, we will discuss a different topic related to clean energy, explaining complex topics in a way you can understand. Become part of the community as we help to make a brighter and healthier New York.
As the sun crests on the horizon, a new day dawns in our state. A new hope for tomorrow is rising, a clean future we create. Tomorrow we breathe easier, tomorrow the skies are clear. Today we are plugging in, the future of New York is here.
Joining us this week on the podcast is Anya Kamenetz. Anya is the author of the Golden Hour newsletter, previously covering education for NPR, where she co-created the podcast Life Kit Parenting. She's also written many books, and we're going to put links in the show notes to learn more. Anya, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to talk about a 2021 study. It asked children and young adults across the world about climate change. 75% of people said that the future is frightening, with 45% saying that climate-related feelings are negatively impacting their daily life. So those are very, very high numbers, far beyond what I probably would have imagined. So I want to start by kind of laying the groundwork and saying this isn't really something we can ignore with our children.
That's exactly right. And I'm so glad you started there, because actually that study was one of the first aha moments for me. You know, I'd covered education, covered young people's well-being for 2 decades, and I had my own climate anxieties, but it was that Lancet study with 10,000 young people around the world that helped me understand, yeah, actually this is a youth mental health issue. Climate change is a youth development issue. And no, we can't ignore it. I mean, it is impacting schools all over the country that have had to close for extreme weather, for fires, for extreme heat, for flooding. Here in New York City, we've dealt with wildfire smoke in the last few years. We've dealt with flash floods, sometimes from rainstorms that don't even have names, right? So this is in fact impacting our kids' daily lives, and we can't ignore it anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And the information we'll talk about today, isn't just for parents. It can apply to anyone with children, young adults in their life. So I have a 4-year-old. Her name is Lucy. She's a big fan of the podcast. She really just likes the opening song, though. I don't know if she still listens when I start talking. But, right now her fears are like things like ghosts under her bed. And I feel equipped as a parent to validate those feelings, explain they aren't real. I'm getting into the next phase of parenting where I have to deal with real fears like climate change. So what advice do you have for young parents when they bring up these topics for the first time?
I love that question. And, I sympathize with you. I think that, we all kind of wish that we could put off these conversations a little bit longer. The practical advice that I have is that, you need to put on your own oxygen mask. So the reason that this is so scary to talk about oftentimes is because parents have their own feelings about climate change and their own fears for their children's future. So I really recommend that parents seek out sources of support. When it comes to talking to kids, I mean, the really nice thing is that the younger the kids are, and if you have hopefully that supportive relationship with them, they can take a lot of stuff in stride. And so when I worked on the Life Kit podcast, we worked in partnership with Sesame Workshop. The premise is that there's no off-topic conversation. It just has to do with how you talk about it. Based on your family circumstances, you might have to talk about a pet that died, a grandparent that is sick, a divorce. You might have to talk to your kid about racism that they're encountering in their daily lives. And these are big, scary, unsolvable things, just like climate change. And the answer is always the same. You really give the basic facts. This is what's happening. You say, this is what we're doing. These are what other people are doing. You talk about the helpers. And then you talk about, I'm always going to be here to keep you safe. And those are the three basic messages. And we can, of course, elaborate on that. But it's always possible to talk about it. The scary thing is to not talk about it and just let them overhear this and that on the news and not have a place to put those qualms.
Yeah, it's a good point. And it's something that I feel like I'm also dealing with is, my wife and I talk about everything, politics and climate change and all these types of things. And she's probably starting to absorb some of this, of what we're talking about. So what advice do you have for parents to start including their children in, bigger conversations that they might overhear?
Yeah, this is huge. I talked to one educator who said that her research showed that kindergartners are coming to school with the basic idea that humans are destroying the earth and the earth is dying. So they are getting, that is what the media says, and that is what overheard conversations are. So we need to tackle it head on. And the way to do that is to say, have you heard the word climate change? What are your questions about climate change? And give the simplest possible example. When humans, we burn the fuels that we use to get around, to make things, airplanes in the sky, all of that goes up in the sky. It makes a big blanket. And that blanket can make you too hot, just like if you have a fever, right? The blanket can be too hot. There are other ways for us to do the things that we need without making that kind of blanket that's too heavy. And so that's why we and lots of people are shifting to riding our bikes, having solar panels, and we talk about the solutions and the alternatives that they can see around them, hopefully, and they can learn more about it. And that's the conversation. You talk about what's causing it, you talk about the solutions.
My goal is to raise a child who is climate conscious, and you have to thread that needle of not making them more alarmed than they should be, but you also want them to be informed. And really, this applies to every topic, I would assume. So how much of it would you say is imposing values, which is kind of like the proactive way, imposing conservation, stewardship, doing activities as a family? And then how much is talking about like the bigger things that, you necessarily as a one person can't control on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that climate change is such a vast phenomenon, and it has so many different manifestations. But I really think that there's a lot to be done, first of all, that is just part of our normal everyday lives. Things like wearing sunscreen when it's hot, or, maybe wearing a mask if there's an air quality issue. And those are basic health and safety things. Then you think about, how we want to introduce our children to nature and to loving the outdoors, to caring for plants and animals around us. If that's a pet situation, a gardening situation, if that's cleaning up a park, how can they be engaged in, the healing parts of being part of the natural world? And that really is part of their climate education. And then I think the part that we, may not have as much support for, but is really important to do, is how do our kids learn to see themselves as citizens and part of a broader system, right? Because so much of the time, the environmental-based education for kids focuses on the individual carbon footprint actions. And while I'm a big fan of composting, I'm a big fan of reduction in waste, we know, and kids can see, that the kinds of decisions that are made that really affect the future are done by politicians, and they're done by city council members, and they're done at all these different levels of government. And so even very young kids, and I'm engaged with a group called Climate Families NYC, where they bring kids along to protest in strollers, and they have them draw pictures and send them to the governor. And these are things where kids can see that they can be a part of actual real action.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me to my next question. So I've been involved day to day with this now for almost 2 years, and I get to, on a daily basis, talk to those politicians and work on those big changes. And then recently I got asked to speak to a group of junior year high schoolers. And, I was doing my education pitch, got a lot of good points out there, and then there was time for questions. And one of them asked me, what should I actually be doing? How do I get involved? I think was the exact wording. How do I get involved? And I kind of stopped because I was kind of stuck where what you were just talking about of the really big picture stuff, like getting involved in advocacy, writing letters, stuff like that. Do I steer them in the direction of individual carbon footprint type things? And I didn't really know. So I'm going to ask you, and then I'm going to pass this along to that group that I spoke with. But for that high school level where they actually have time and energy and knowledge, how do we harness that and put them to work?
I think that lasting change comes from people that are fired up and that are using their talents and their interests. So I really think about Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson's Venn diagram of climate action, which is like, what does the world need? What are you good at? And what brings you joy? And so the question is really for those young kids to say, like, well, are you the scientific engineering type? Do you really want to be immersed in learning about, robotics and electrification and the technologies that are going to bring us towards sustainability? Are you a kid who is really fired up about communications, about making videos, about making art to get this message across, get it out there? Are you that debate team kid and that kid who wants to run for public office one day and wants to, doesn't mind like bothering politicians or circulating, doing phone banking? And so, I really would encourage kids who, if they're not sure, definitely get out there and try it and don't limit themselves to just what's available maybe inside their school or inside their education. I know a lot of amazing teenagers who have discovered climate action through social media. And, obviously social media gets a bad rap, but there's an entire world of sustainability influencers and advocates and activists who have they bridge between, social media and real life, and they use the social media to plan the action, then they go out and they do the action. So there's a little bit of looking out to look inward, but always thinking about, Bill McKibben has the great line about what can I as an individual do? Anything that stops making yourself just as an individual. So anything you do with other people is a thing to do. And so yet another path for thinking about this is like, well, what are people in your neighborhood excited about? What are your people in your community excited about? What are they getting engaged in? Is there something that you'd like to be a part of or to start?
Yeah, that's a much better answer than I gave. So I'm glad I asked, and I'm glad I'm going to pass that along to that group. So another thing that the study looked at, the one we talked about at the top of the podcast, was dissatisfaction with the government response. And this was, a global survey. So it covered not just the United States, but it showed that people realize that the government's not doing as much as they should to combat climate change. And there's a phenomenon out there of climate defeatism that people are just feeling like we can't do anything. How do we harness the passion that younger people have for fighting against climate change and not having them feel defeated? Because it is very hard to make those big changes.
I love that question. And it's really super important because we see that among younger people, even among those who are, for example, supporting the GOP, which is adamantly opposed to almost all climate action, meaningful climate action right now. They're concerned about climate change, but the new flavor of misinformation about climate change it's not happening, but it's people saying the solutions don't matter. It's too late. Right. And so this is really, defeatism is not only something that's organically arising among young people, it's something that's actively being pushed. And if you go onto YouTube, if you go onto some of these platforms, you're going to hear people saying that for motivated reasons because they want to stop climate action. And so in order to counter that, we have to thread a careful needle because teenagers are very alert to any form of hypocrisy, any form of Pollyanna, spoon feeding them, optimism when it doesn't seem realistic. And so they need to, they need to hear a message that is measured, where we look at what are the real achievements that have happened. And I think here, if you're looking in New York State, there are lots of things to point to. In New York City, there's lots of things to point to. Where is their real action? Where is their real progress? And help them see that, yes, they can make a difference, that there has been a change, even just in the last several years, about the big picture projections of where we're going to get to as far as degrees of warming over the historical average. And so, being measured in that message. And then the other part that I think is important to emphasize is, I talked about bringing you, like climate action, bringing you joy. This needs to be sustainable. It needs to be something that is worth doing for its own sake and not necessarily because of the outcome. Young people need to be able to told that they can take breaks and it's okay to think about other things. I think when you see like the small percentage of young kids who really do get fired up about climate action, sometimes they burn out because they expect things to change overnight. And so that's where I get a lot of joy from the intergenerational conversation, where sometimes you have older folks saying like, I love your energy. And also this is a long haul. We're going to be working this the rest of our lives.
Absolutely. You mentioned a couple of the resources groups out there, but are there any particular places you would point parents to learn more, get more information? It can include your own content as well.
Yeah. So on my Substack, The Golden Hour, I write regularly about this topic, about parenting in the climate crisis, about communicating with kids and helping face tough stuff, a lot of it about our processing our own emotions. I work with a group called Climate Mental Health Network, and we have programs and guides for parents, for teachers that are backed by research that help incorporate climate emotions. A lot of teachers are looking for this material because they find that as they explore teaching climate change, a lot of feelings come up among students, and they really need to be armed with this material. So yeah, Climate Mental Health Network is a good place to start. And the Golden Hour, yeah, is my newsletter.
Absolutely. And I swear this wasn't just a selfish ask of a guest, because my wife is also a teacher. So she has asked me similar questions of how do you incorporate that type of, values or messaging into a packed curriculum in the day.
Yeah.
So that sounds like a great resource for her and her colleagues as well.
Awesome.
So hopefully we can end on a little optimism, and I appreciate all the advice you've given. So this is changing very quickly, and you look at it on a higher level throughout history. Right now, we're seeing, more frequent weather events. These are the things people have warned us about. And the children are going to be growing up with that, whereas my parents and even me as a kid, I don't remember storms like this or orange skies for sure. So do you think because now that the crisis is visible in front of us, that there's going to be actual shift in the public perception as those fired up children grow up and start voting?
I've been through too many cycles to assume that anything happens automatically, but I do have hope in terms of where we put our energy. So I think that it's really important that we ask these questions and that we try to formulate a good collective response. I don't think that there's any automatic victory out there, but I definitely feel energized and hopeful every day the more I spend time with the young people who are really trying to make a difference.
Is that good advice for even adults that start to feel a little burnt out fighting against climate change? Go spend some time with those kids?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that there's the way that we engage with younger generations needs to be, we can't be sort of vampiring off of their energy. And young kids are very sensitive to the idea that we're putting them in the role of having to fix this when they didn't create it. But in terms of I've had, experience. I work now advising a group called Jewish Youth Climate Movement, and they're a high school network of kids. And, they hate being underestimated and they hate being cast as saviors. But when we're listening to them and when there's a real exchange of resources and when we're really empowering them, I think it's hugely important. There's nothing that is more powerful and effective to stimulate climate action than thought and love and care for the next generation. That is the most powerful behavior message. There's a new study that just came out about this actually at the Annenberg School of Communication. And it found, there's a group called Dear Tomorrow, a wonderful group where they just ask you to write a letter to the next generation, write a letter to a child or a niece or a nephew or just any child in the next generation. And that act of empathetic imagining and thinking about what they're going to inherit, that's something that makes a huge difference internally to people, and it can motivate real change, real behavioral change.
Anya, I appreciate your time and thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Barry.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Plugging In. I hope you learned something, and I hope you share this knowledge with someone else. It would be incredibly helpful if you leave us a 5-star review wherever you found this podcast. If there's a topic you would like us to cover in the future or have a question about clean energy, send us an email at podcast@aceny.org. You can follow us on social media using the links in the show notes, or consider joining our Clean Energy Supporters mailing list at aceny.org/support. Your support is crucial to creating a brighter and healthier New York. I'll see you next time.
As the sun crests on the horizon, a new day dawns in our state. A new hope for tomorrow is rising, a clean future we create. Tomorrow we breathe easier, tomorrow the skies are clear. Today we are plugging in.